Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. In this video, I will share the fantasy relevant numbers I use to identify wide receivers to target for the Week 10 main slate. Before we unpack Week 10, I want to take a quick look back at Week 9 and see how these fantasy relevant numbers actually correlate. In Week 9, the top 5 projected wide receivers were as follows: Mike Evans from Tampa Bay, Chris Godwin from Tampa Bay, Kenny Golladay from Detroit, Stephon Diggs from Minnesota, and Tyler Lockett from Seattle. The actual top 5 scoring wide receivers were as follows: Tyler Lockett, 43.20 fantasy points; Mike Evans, 39 fantasy points; DK Metcalf, 30 fantasy points; Marvin Jones, 29.60 fantasy points; and Tyreek Hill, 29.50 fantasy points. Likewise, these were the top 5 wide receivers as far as ownership. Chris Godwin led the way with 21.61% ownership. Next was Danny Amendola with 18.58% ownership. Third was Keenan Allen with 17.22% ownership. Fourth was Kenny Golladay with 16.47% ownership. And Tyler Lockett was fifth with 15.73% ownership. These top 5 scoring wide receivers had an average score of 34.26 fantasy points. They also had an average target of 12.2 targets. This breaks down to 2.81 fantasy points per target. Only one of the top 5 in ownership was actually in the top 5 scoring, and that was Lockett. I like to target wide receivers in games with the higher projected totals, the wide receivers that are obviously getting a lot of targets, and I also like to consider matchups. In Week 10, these are the wide receivers I will be targeting and why. Please follow along with this chart. I developed this chart last week. I'm still fine-tuning it. I encourage you to please drop any opinions or comments that you may have about what you'd like to see or anything that you feel that I could do different or add to it to make it better. But as I said, I'm still fine-tuning it. The receivers that I'm targeting are all the way to the left, highlighted in green. Yellow means I'm on the fence. On the categories, the green obviously is the best. Yellow is middle of the road, and red is the worst in comparison to the best. It doesn't mean they're the worst wide receiver, but that's just the worst numbers in that particular category. And for the wide receiver, the categories that I'm utilizing are targets per game, fantasy points per game, defensive fantasy points per game, how much the defense is given up to that particular position, what the ranking is for the defense against that position, their opponent, ADOT, which is average depth of target. I also have fantasy points per snap. That's with all things relevant. And then in the last column, I have the over and under. So to start things off in Week 10, at the top of the list is Michael Thomas. He's $8,300, and for good reason. He's getting 11.1 targets per game. He's scoring the most on this slate to 24.5 fantasy points per game. The defense, Atlanta's defense, is giving up 42.9 fantasy points per game to wide receiver position, which is the second highest on this slate. Atlanta DVP against the wide receiver is 29. He's averaging 0.381 points per snap. It's the second highest total on the board. It just basically checks off all the boxes. Now, this salary, obviously, it's going to take a lot to pay that off. And, there's a lot of weapons there in New Orleans. But I feel like Atlanta's probably going to push them because I feel like they're going to be able to score as well through the air. And I feel that Drew Brees is going to have to keep the pressure on him. Drew Brees is completing an extraordinary 75% of his passes this year. He's only had a couple games as a sample, but Michael Thomas is pretty much guaranteed to have a really nice, if anything, a floor. Um, and they're also a 13.5 point home favorite, which I often like when I'm looking at my wide receivers. This is a nice game to stack. There's a lot of pieces to it that you can stack, and I'll definitely have some shares of Michael Thomas. It's just a matter of getting up there to that 8,300 and balancing out my lineup. Next, in the same game, Julio Jones. He's 7,500, so he's $800 less than Thomas. Should be a positive game script. Back and forth, high scoring, second highest total on the board. They're a 13.5 point underdog, so that says they're going to be playing from behind. He's getting 9.3 targets per game. He's averaging 19.7 fantasy points per game. New Orleans has given up 38.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. His average depth of targets 12.9. He's averaging 0.373 points per snap. And another wide receiver that I would like to use as a piece in a possible game stack. I'm sure this game's going to have a lot of exposure as far as stacks. And these wide receivers, the main pieces. Matt Ryan's back as well. That'll definitely help Julio Jones. So I'll definitely have some shares of Julio. I'll probably be stacking him one way or the other, either with Ryan or bringing him back with Breeze and Thomas. Next is Chris Godwin, 7,400 from Tampa Bay. I like Godwin this week better than Evans. I think Evans was going to be shadowed by Patrick Peterson. Arizona's allowing 39.3 fantasy points to the wide receiver position. He's scoring 22.7 fantasy points per game. He's getting just under 9 targets per game at 8.9. He's got a nice 3.323 points per snap. This is the highest total on the board. This is another game and another piece that I'm going to be interested in stacking. I always have a lot of interest in the games with the higher totals. If they're going to be high-scoring games, they're going to have the players necessary for it to be high-scoring. I say that pretty much in all my videos. It's not where I stop; it's where I start. Consider other players as well and looking at matchups and things like that. But I definitely have some interest in Godwin, and I have due to the matchup that Evans has. I don't think Peterson will completely shut out Evans, but I think Godwin, it might be his turn. This game sets up to be pretty high scoring. Next, Allen Robinson from Chicago. The matchup isn't great. He's probably going to draw a lot of coverage from Darius Slay, but I will say that last year in Week 10 in Chicago, Robinson had a really big game. 6 receptions, 133 yards, and 2 touchdowns versus Detroit. So the matchup with Slay is not great, but he is getting a lot of targets. He's just under 9 targets per game at 8.8. The Detroit defense has given up 38.4 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. It does have a low total. I just have a feeling that this is going to be a get well game for Chicago. There's not a lot pointing there. There's going to be probably lower ownership on Robinson due to the way that Trubisky's been playing. So this might be a real sneaky game to stack. Get some exposure to Chicago. He's the main cog. He's $6,300, and I definitely have a lot of interest in Robinson this week. Next is Golden Tate from the Giants. Ingram has been ruled out. The other wide receiver, Shepard's out. Those targets have to go somewhere, and the Jets are pitiful in the secondary. I'll just refer you back to the Miami Dolphins and what Fitzpatrick did to him last week. Brian Poole does provide a tough matchup. against Tate, but based on volume alone, I can see Tate having a really good game. I have a lot of interest in Saquon Barkley as well, and that was in another video. But Tate's going to be the main beneficiary of the passing game. I will say that this, with the setting up to be such a nice Saquon Barkley game, because the Jets linebackers are just decimated. So they've suffered a lot of injuries, and I mean, if Barkley's going off, that could take away from Tate, and you also have to hope that there's a little bit of pushback by the Jets, that they're going to. This game total is not really intriguing at 44 and a half points, but that might drive down some ownership of Tate. And at 5,900, it doesn't take a lot to get value at that price. And he's getting 8.4 targets per game. The defense is giving up the Jets are giving up 41.2 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. And I have a lot of interest in Golden Tate this week. Next is Larry Fitzgerald from Arizona. Tampa Bay's given up 48 points, fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, which is the worst on this slate. They're number 32 versus wide receiver. It's highest total on the board. Fitzgerald's getting 7 targets a game. Now, the thing about Arizona is this right here, this average depth of target. They don't throw the ball down the field much, so there's not a lot of air yards, which means there's not a lot of creation for actual receiving yards. But they do run a lot of plays, and this definitely has a positive game script. Tampa Bay puts some points on them. You're not going to run the ball against Tampa Bay. They've been very stingy, one of the top 3 teams against the run this year. So I could see Fitzgerald and Kirk getting peppered with a lot of passes this game. And another thing is he does have a good matchup against Hargraves, who is allowing a 113.3 passer rating to quarterbacks. He's 5 inches shorter than Fitzpatrick, and Fitzpatrick is getting 19% of the target share for Arizona. Next up is Calvin Ridley. Julio is going to probably draw a lot of coverage from Lattimore. Ridley gets a nice matchup against Eli Apple. New Orleans is allowing 38.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, second highest total on the board. He has a 13.3 yard ADOT. Positive game script. In the last 2 games Ridley has played against New Orleans, he's had 15 receptions, 241 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. And that's combined the 2 games. Should be fairly easy to get value at 5,400, with a lot of interest going towards Julio Jones. And this definitely sets up to be a nice high-scoring game. Probably lopsided with the spread where it is, but you can see the situation where it's going way above what the total is. Just mentioned this guy when I was talking about Fitzgerald. Christian Kirk, averaging almost 9 targets per game, 8.8. Again, Tampa Bay is giving up 48 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, dead last against the wide receiver position. Highest total on the board at 52.5 points. Positive game script. I love stacking different pieces of this game both ways. I'm going to have a lot of exposure to this game as well, and don't even mind if I'm using Murray in the quarterback spot, using both those wide receivers. Definitely like the price. 5,200 doesn't take much to get there in a 1-point PPR. So I'll have my shares of Christian Kirk. Next is Jamison Crowder from the Jets, getting 7.4 targets per game. The Giants are giving up 43.9 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, which is second worst on this this slate. Giants are 30th against the wide receiver position. It is a fairly low game total, 44.5 points. But I believe the Giants are going to be able to score on the Jets, and the Jets are going to have to move the ball through the air against the Giants. It's for only $5,000 salary and 7.4 targets per game. Darnold has proven that he does like to go to Crowder a lot, and I just like this matchup that Crowder has against the Giants. Now, the receivers that I have in yellow are Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp. I have a lot of interest. Hill has a really, really good matchup in Tennessee versus Sims, who's allowing a 133.3 quarterback rating. Mahomes is back, and I'm just worried about the ownership for him, that price, all the different weapons that Kansas City has. He definitely has the capability to smash a slate, and with Mahomes back and third highest total on the board, I'm just not sure how much that they'll have to do. Tyreek Hill went off last week with Matt Moore, so he's quarterback proof, I guess. So um, it's intriguing. If I was at 7,700, I'd probably lean more to going up to Michael Thomas, spending the 600, or spending 100 less and getting Julio. I just like those better, but I do have some interest in Tyreek Hill. Cooper Kupp, this guy is phenomenal, and the thing about him is, with the bye week, hopefully everybody forgot what he did 2 weeks ago to Cincinnati, where I believe it was 40-some fantasy points, and he's getting targeted a lot. Cooks is out. He's 7,300. I don't think the running game's going to do much against Pittsburgh. Not crazy about the total, 44 point total, but he's getting almost just under 11 targets per game at 10.9 targets per game, scoring 22.8 fantasy points per game, 3.373 points per snap. It checks all the boxes. And I'll probably have some shares. If I had to choose between Kupp and Hill, I would probably lean towards Kupp. Just feel like there's a lot of unknowns with Hill, even though Hill on paper, the matchup with Sims is pretty phenomenal. But there's a lot of targets there. With the Rams, they have Woods and Kupp and Gurley, so I'll probably have some shares of him, but not as much as the other places. It's just hard to get away from him with the target share that he has. So these these are the wide receivers that I'm going to be targeting in week 10. I do feel like there's a lot of value this week in the wide receiver position, where you could spend up for one and find some value in some of the lower salary wide receivers. The ones I mentioned, Tate, Fitzgerald, Ridley, Kirk, Crowder. There's a lot of value in those wide receivers. So summing up the wide receivers that I'm going to have in my player pool: Michael Thomas, you can follow over here. Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, Chris Godwin, Allen Robinson, Golden Tate, Larry Fitzgerald, Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, and Jamison Crowder. Probably going to definitely add Cooper Kupp on the fence with Tyreek Hill, just because if I'm at 77, I'm probably going to figure out a way to get up to Michael Thomas. But I'll let you know for sure when I do lineup building tomorrow and put this together and do some optimized lineups with the optimizer. And I'll also be able to look at some ownership too. If the ownership is really, really low on Tyreek Hill, I wouldn't have any problems trying to get him in some of my lineups. I just feel like I definitely need Mahomes with Hill. And I like to stack, and I don't know what I'm going to stack in that game unless I brought it back with the Tennessee running game. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, because if you believe that Kansas City is going to go off in the passing game, put points on the board, at some point the running game is phased out when you're trying to play catch up. So I wanted to talk about this chart again real quick. Feel free to screenshot it. There's not a link that I can give you. I haven't figured out. I don't know if there's a way I can put it below where you can just click on the link, excuse me, and get to it. But if you want to pause the video or screenshot it or do whatever you want and use it however you want, I feel it's some really valuable information. And again, if you would like to see something added to it, or you have any suggestions, please let me know. These are the areas that I use when I'm trying to put together the players in my player pool. And I really appreciate any comments that you may have. It really helps me out when you guys share these videos. Like them, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified when my next video posts. I will be posting, excuse me, tight end defense special teams video shortly, and then tomorrow we'll be doing lineup building, the optimizer. I'll be doing game by game breakdown and putting all this together and build some winning lineups for Sunday. But you can also follow me on Twitter at about or winning about. Instead of about winning, it's winning about. I appreciate the guys that have subscribed and been following me. My subscriptions have been trending upwards, and I really appreciate that and plan on making this channel a lot better. So I'll be back shortly with tight end defense special teams. My name is Ty Patton. This is all about winning daily fantasy sports, and I'll see you guys real soon. Thanks a lot.